The sands of North Africa, in the early weeks of 1943, were the stage for one of the most consequential introductions of American military power to the European theater of the Second World War. For Generalfeldmarschall Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, the American presence was less a threat and more a profound, almost insulting inconvenience. His initial view of the American soldier was rooted in a deep-seated professional contempt, born not merely of German arrogance, but of strategic analysis and the sheer brutal efficiency with which his Africa Corps had dominated the desert wars against the British for nearly 2 years. Rommel was a master of mobile warfare, commanding highly professional and fiercely disciplined Panzer divisions, troops hardened by continuous combat and steeped in the doctrine of blitzkrieg. He viewed the American forces, newly arrived in North Africa following Operation Torch, as essentially an untried, soft, and logistically dependent force. Their training was untested by real battle. Their equipment, while plentiful, was not yet proven against the superior engineering of the German Panzers. And, crucially, their officer corps lacked the cohesive, aggressive combat experience that was the hallmark of the Wehrmacht. This disdain was widely shared by his command staff and permeated the German ranks. They viewed their upcoming encounter with the Americans not as a serious battle, but as a training exercise against an inferior amateur opponent, a necessary hurdle before turning their attention back to their primary nemesis, the British Eighth Army. The strategic situation leading up to the confrontation at the Kasserine Pass was one of desperation for the Axis powers, yet momentary confidence for Rommel. Following the catastrophic British victory at El Alamein and the successful Allied landings in North Africa, the remaining German and Italian forces had been pushed back into the tight coastal area of Tunisia. Rommel's primary goal was to prevent the Allies from splitting the Axis forces and achieving a decisive breakthrough to the sea. He knew the British, under General Bernard Montgomery, were the true threat, possessing the experience and material power to crush him. However, the American forces, deployed across a long, thinly held line stretching through the treacherous central Tunisian Atlas Mountains, presented a target of opportunity. This sector was characterized by difficult, rugged terrain, cold weather, and poor communication lines, a deployment that Rommel immediately perceived as weak and strategically vulnerable. The American Second Corps, under General Lloyd Fredendall, was stretched thin, unfamiliar with the terrain, and critically reliant on an overly centralized command structure that discouraged initiative and rapid local decision-making, qualities essential for desert and mountain warfare. Rommel's plan, which resulted in the Battle of Kasserine Pass, was therefore executed with an expectation of swift, predictable success. His objective was not just a localized tactical victory, but a dramatic, demoralizing blow against the Americans that would shatter their confidence, force them to withdraw and consolidate, and buy the Axis forces precious time. The engagement was meant to confirm his already held prejudices, that the American divisions were second-rate, poorly led, and brittle under pressure. He anticipated a breakthrough that would require minimal effort from his veteran Panzer divisions. His forces, spearheaded by the highly experienced 10th and 21st Panzer divisions, were poised to strike at the seam of the American and French deployment. Rommel felt that the inexperience of the American soldiers, coupled with the systematic inflexibility of their corps command, guaranteed a collapse that would allow him to sweep rapidly through the mountain passes and achieve his strategic objective. The approaching battle was, in his mind, merely a punitive exercise against a militarily soft enemy, a foregone conclusion that would highlight the immense gulf between the seasoned professionalism of the Africa Corps and the naive enthusiasm of the newly arrived Americans. He saw Kasserine Pass as a chance to school the new boys on the harsh realities of desert combat before facing the serious challenges posed by the British veterans. The cold, clear morning of February 14, 1943, inaugurated the American phase of the war in North Africa with a shock that reverberated across the entire Allied command. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, acting on his ingrained belief in the inexperience of his American adversaries, launched a devastating two-pronged assault that struck the thinly held American defensive line in the central Tunisian Atlas Mountains. This was the opening salvo of the Battle of Kasserine Pass, and it immediately confirmed every single one of Rommel's contemptuous prejudices. The initial German attack, executed by elements of the veteran 10th and 21st Panzer divisions, was a masterclass in swift, concentrated, mechanized warfare. It exploited the fatal weaknesses inherent in the American deployment, a long, exposed defensive perimeter manned by troops who had never faced the shock of blitzkrieg armored thrusts and whose leadership was plagued by centralization and hesitation. The speed and ferocity of the Panzer grenadiers and the powerful coordinated movements of the Panzer tanks, especially the advanced Tiger I heavy tanks, whose armor was virtually impervious to the American 37mm anti-tank guns, broke the American line almost instantly. The primary American failures in this initial engagement were systemic and immediate. Communication broke down completely. Units, lacking coherent senior command guidance, were often cut off and fought in disconnected pockets. The green American troops, despite flashes of individual courage, simply lacked the collective experience and training to react fluidly to the chaos of a coordinated armored attack. Many units, surprised by the sheer momentum of the Panzers, either fled their positions in panic or were quickly bypassed and overrun. Entire battalions were scattered, their equipment abandoned. The German advance was devastatingly efficient, creating a massive, demoralizing gap in the Allied line. This collapse culminated in the infamous tactical decision of General Lloyd Fredendall, the commander of the American II Corps, whose centralized, distant command post, dubbed the Hideout by his own men due to its position 70 miles behind the front lines, failed utterly to grasp the urgency or severity of the situation. Fredendall's rigid, overly cautious orders and his inability to delegate authority stifled any chance of local commanders staging an effective, cohesive defense. Crucial reserves were held back, reinforcements arrived piecemeal, and counterattacks were launched too late or with insufficient force. The initial phase of the battle saw American formations suffer horrendous losses in materiel. Tanks, including the highly anticipated M4 Sherman, proved vulnerable to the longer-range, more powerful guns of the German Panzers. The 37mm anti-tank guns and the 75mm guns of the earlier Shermans were simply outmatched by the armor of the German Mark IVs and the Tigers. The Germans advanced almost unopposed through the Fade Pass and then drove towards the critical logistical hub of Speiitla, capturing vast quantities of abandoned American fuel, ammunition, and food, a prize Rommel urgently needed. The tactical triumph of the German armor was overwhelming. The speed of the American withdrawal, often turning into a rout, confirmed every negative assumption Rommel held. His official reports and private comments during this period reflected a complete vindication of his initial contempt. He described the American resistance as immature, the leadership as inept, and the troops as totally inexperienced and easily shattered. He noted with satisfaction that the Americans lacked the necessary tenacity and discipline required for prolonged, intense battle. For the Desert Fox, the initial fight at Kasserine was proof that the American army was merely a logistical giant with feet of clay, a force that presented no serious challenge to the professional Wehrmacht. The collapse was not localized, it was massive. The German forces broke through the initial mountain line, shattered the American command and control, and were poised to pour into the Tunisian plains. The primary objective of the Axis forces, to isolate and destroy the American forces and seize the vital logistical base at Tessaba, now seemed easily within reach. As Rommel gazed upon the wreckage, the abandoned vehicles, and the speed of the American retreat, his belief in the inherent superiority of his veteran German forces was cemented. He saw a quick, decisive victory ahead and fully expected the entire American presence in North Africa to crumble swiftly, leaving him free to face the more formidable British Eighth Army. This moment of overwhelming American defeat was the nadir of the Allied campaign and the peak of Rommel's confidence in his judgment of his new enemy. The tide of battle,
initially a devastating German flood, began to slow and solidify on the frigid high ground of Tunisia in the days immediately following the American rout. This critical shift, occurring roughly between February 17th and February 22nd, 1943, was the pivotal moment that forced Generalfeldmarschall Erwin Rommel to fundamentally reassess his deeply held assumptions about the fighting spirit and operational capacity of the American Army. This period marks Act 3, the stand at Thala and Zbetla, the uncomfortable turning point where German contempt first collided with genuine, unexpected American tenacity. Following the initial spectacular breakthrough at Battered Pass and the subsequent capture of the logistical hub at Zbetla, Rommel's forces, specifically elements of the 10th Panzer Division, were advancing rapidly toward the critical town of Thala. The capture of Thala and its onward drive toward Tebessa would have completely cut off the Allied forces, resulting in a disaster potentially far worse than Pearl Harbor in terms of military material and morale. Rommel expected the Americans to continue their panicked withdrawal, leaving the road open. Instead, the American line stiffened, not through the actions of the previously broken units, but through the rapid, aggressive deployment of experienced reinforcements and, critically, the immediate, overwhelming application of American logistical and artillery power. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, now fully aware of the scale of the crisis and having ordered the replacement of the ineffective General Fredendall with General George S. Patton, Jr., though Patton's official command was briefly delayed, had channeled vital, fresh resources into the threatened sector. The defense began to coalesce around units that had not yet been shattered, notably the veteran 9th Infantry Division and key elements of the 1st Armored Division. These were not the green troops of the initial defeat, and they were led by junior officers who, finally free of the rigid centralized command, began to exercise aggressive local initiative. The nature of the fighting abruptly changed from disorganized retreat to fierce, localized counterattacks and stubborn, coordinated defensive stands. The most shocking element of this resistance to Rommel was the sudden, massive presence of American artillery. As the 10th Panzer Division approached Thala, they encountered a concentrated artillery barrage unlike anything the Germans had expected from the amateurs. American commanders, recognizing the vulnerability of their tanks against the Tigers, massed their highly mobile 105 and 155 mm field artillery pieces near Thala and fired with devastating coordinated accuracy. The arrival of the British 26th Armored Brigade also provided essential, if momentary, steel to the line, but it was the sheer volume of American shells that truly stunned the German advance. Rommel's panzer commanders were halted not by superior tactics, but by the relentless crushing hammer blow of concentrated firepower. The sheer weight of metal arriving on the German positions proved highly demoralizing and disrupted the crucial momentum of the blitzkrieg. For the first time, Rommel realized that American industrial capacity could be translated instantly into lethal battlefield presence, far surpassing the logistical limitations that constantly plagued the Afrika Korps. Another crucial turning point was the timely arrival of the Air Force. Following days of poor weather, the skies cleared and the overwhelming strength of the Allied air superiority was unleashed. American and British fighter bombers savaged German forward positions, supply lines, and isolated armored columns, making daytime movement perilous and dramatically raising the cost of holding any ground. The American ability to generate and sustain this level of coordinated air and artillery power was a resource Rommel simply could not counter in Tunisia. The cumulative effect of these coordinated actions, the stiffening of the American infantry, the relentless artillery hammer, and the suffocating air power, was that Rommel's thrust ground to an unavoidable halt just outside Thala. The line, which had been catastrophically brittle just days earlier, had finally, stubbornly refused to break. The cost was high on both sides, but the American army had achieved the most crucial military feat. It had survived the shock of first contact and was now learning and adapting under fire. Rommel, ever the perceptive tactical genius, immediately registered this shift. The initial contempt he held for the soft Americans gave way to a grudging, professional acknowledgement of their resilience, and more importantly, their terrifying potential once they mastered the art of war. The German failure to capture Thala signaled that the brief second happy time against the Americans was over, and a far more tenacious, materially superior enemy had arrived to stay.
The final, decisive stage of the Battle of Kasserine Pass was reached through a convergence of tactical necessity and strategic realization, marking the true turning point in Generalfeldmarschall Erwin Rommel's opinion of the American soldier. Having been halted at Thala and elsewhere by the unexpectedly fierce, massed American artillery fire and the suffocating presence of Allied air power, resources that dramatically surpassed anything the Afrika Korps could muster, Rommel was faced with an untenable tactical situation. He had failed to achieve his primary decisive objective, the destruction of the American forces and the seizure of the vital logistical hub at Tebessa. The American line, though initially shattered, was now rapidly strengthening, supported by an inexhaustible stream of men and materiel. Rommel was far too perceptive a commander to waste his highly trained armored divisions in a prolonged, grinding battle of attrition against a materially superior foe. He recognized that the element of surprise was utterly gone. His offensive momentum was spent, and any further advance would simply lead to the piecemeal annihilation of his irreplaceable Panzer forces by the combination of fixed defenses, relentless artillery barrages, and the now clear skies dominated by Allied fighter-bombers. His primary strategic objective for the entire Tunisian campaign was the consolidation of the fragmented Axis armies. His own Afrika Korps, with General von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army to the north, to form a single, coherent defensive line against the eventual full-scale Allied assault. A continued, costly engagement at Kasserine was now counterproductive to this crucial goal. Therefore, between February 22 and February 24, 1943, Rommel made the calculated, agonizing decision to execute a tactical withdrawal. This was not a retreat in disarray, but a highly disciplined, phased retrograde movement designed to disengage his forces cleanly and minimize losses. His divisions, still intact and skilled, pulled back through the passes they had conquered just days earlier, abandoning the ground they had so recently stained with American blood. This withdrawal itself was a testament to the professionalism of the Afrika Korps, managed with expert care under the vigilant eyes of the returning American forces. This pivotal action, the decision to stop fighting the Americans, was fueled by Rommel's newly revised assessment of his opponent. The contempt that had defined his mindset in Act 1 and been seemingly confirmed in Act 2 was now replaced by a grudging, professional respect bordering on deep concern. Rommel, the master of logistics and armored thrusts, had seen that the American forces possessed terrifying qualities he could not ignore. Firstly, logistical might. The speed with which the Americans poured overwhelming amounts of artillery, ammunition, and fresh troops into the threatened sectors of Thala and Tebessa utterly astounded him. He had never faced an enemy capable of recovering from such a devastating initial blow with such instantaneous material force. Rommel realized he was not fighting a conventional army. He was fighting the limitless industrial capacity of the United States, instantly deployed to the battlefield. Secondly, tenacity and adaptability. While the initial American formations broke easily, the subsequent units displayed a stubborn, almost reckless tenacity. Crucially, the American junior officers and soldiers had demonstrated the ability to learn rapidly under fire. The initial tactical blunders and hesitation were replaced by fierce, coordinated local defense.
Rommel understood that the greenness of the American forces was temporary. Their capacity for rapid adaptation was not. Thirdly, air power integration. The moment the weather cleared, the devastating continuous air superiority enjoyed by the Allies, which savaged his supply lines and restricted his movement to the cover of darkness, made any deep offensive impossible. Rommel realized the Americans would always operate under a blanket of air cover he could neither achieve nor challenge. In his subsequent, highly detailed official reports and private letters, Rommel was clear and unequivocal about his observations. He no longer dismissed the Americans as amateurs. Instead, he warned the German High Command that the American soldier possessed a natural ability to fight and was supported by an unparalleled industrial base. He stressed that while their initial leadership was weak, their material potential and adaptability made them a far more formidable foe than the German command in Berlin was willing to believe. His experience at Kasserine Pass was a brutal, personal lesson in the future of modern warfare, one where industrial output and rapid logistical deployment were just as crucial as tactical brilliance. This revised judgment of the American soldier would profoundly influence his defensive planning years later when he was tasked with fortifying the Atlantic Wall against the anticipated Allied invasion of Europe. The American was no longer a joke. He was a serious, powerful, and ultimately inevitable threat.
The Battle of Kasserine Pass concluded as a tactical German victory, but a strategic failure, forcing Generalfeldmarschall Erwin Rommel to retreat and consolidate his forces. However, the most significant result was not the ground gained or lost, but the internal transformation of Rommel's professional view of the Allied opposition. His initial dismissal of the Americans as soft and amateur was obliterated by the reality of the American recovery. The grudging acknowledgement. Rommel was a master strategist who prioritized facts over dogma. In his official report sent up the German chain of command, he issued a clear, urgent warning. Ferocity and endurance. He acknowledged that while the initial American formations lacked experience, the follow-on troops displayed a surprising native ability to fight and tenacity under intense pressure. He recognized their courage was equal to that of the British troops he had fought for years. Unbeatable logistics. The most alarming realization for Rommel was the speed and scale of the American logistical response. The immediate flood of overwhelming artillery and air support demonstrated that Germany was fighting not just soldiers, but the massive, limitless industrial engine of the United States. He knew he could not sustain a battle of attrition against that material reality. Adaptability. Rommel noted that the Americans possessed an extraordinary ability to learn rapidly from their mistakes. The tactical failures under General Fredendell were quickly corrected by aggressive junior officers, and the swift, decisive change in command, symbolized by the arrival of General George S. Patton, Jr. to lead the Second Corps soon after the battle. The influence on D-Day. This revised judgment was not just a historical footnote, but it became a crucial factor in Rommel's later defensive planning. When he was tasked in 1944 to fortify the Atlantic Wall against the anticipated Allied invasion of Europe, his experience at Kasserine Pass was paramount. He fully understood that the initial phase of the invasion would be the only chance for German success. He knew the Americans would overcome any beachhead through sheer, relentless logistical saturation if given enough time. His conviction stemmed directly from Kasserine. The U.S. military would quickly master the fighting, and once their industrial power was ashore, the Germans would be crushed. Consequently, Rommel advocated for a radical, aggressive defense aimed at smashing the invasion on the beaches before the American logistical engine could be deployed. In effect, the green American soldiers who broke and fled at Kasserine taught Rommel a lesson about their nation's raw power that he never forgot. His contempt was replaced by a professional respect for their ultimate lethality, a respect documented in his reports and reflected in his strategy for the defense of France. The battle remains a powerful symbol of the American Army's harsh, devastating introduction to modern warfare and its capacity for rapid, costly learning.